Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Today I Found Out, and in the video today we're answering a viewer question. Gray L asks, when did people start using punctuation, and who invented the most common marks that we use? In the beginning, there was no punctuation, lowercase letters, or even spaces between words. There were also no grammatical way of distinguishing when an idea had finished and a new one begun. It didn't help that the idea of standardized spelling was also not a thing, at least not as we would think of it. Readers will have to model their way through any text as best they could. It would be a little something like that, but for clarity's sake, let me go back to the beginning and use punctuation the way we use it today. In the beginning, there was no punctuation, lowercase letters, or even spaces between words. There also was no grammatical way of distinguishing when an idea had finished and a new one began. It didn't help that the idea of standardized spelling was also not a thing, at least not as we would think of it. Readers were left to muddle their way through any text as best they could. Unsurprisingly, understanding what a particular work was actually saying on the first read-through was pretty well unheard of at the time. The earliest writings, which were syllabic and or logographic, think Mayan and Chinese, had no need for either spacing or punctuation, as each word was typically self-contained in the symbol. However, as previously demonstrated, the lack of punctuation and spacing in alphabetic writing made comprehension very difficult. So hard, in fact, that in ancient Greece it was a rare feat for an individual to understand a text that they were reading the first time through, and the idea of reading out loud to a group without extensive practice beforehand was also not something typically done. Nonetheless, a few notable exceptions aside, punctuation in the West didn't really appear until about the end of the 3rd century BC, when Aristophanes of Byzantium, head librarian at the Library of Alexandria, see our video on what happened to the Library of Alexandria for more information on that, by the way, introduced the precursors of today's punctuation marks. He suggested inserting dots to indicate where a passage ended and the length of pause needed when speaking a text, which is useful in knowing how much breath was needed for the following passage. This convention subsequently began to appear in various Greek works and became, to some degree, relatively standardized. Interestingly, the Greek words that came to be our comma, colon, and period were not describing their dotted punctuation marks themselves, but rather the length of the piece of text that was to be set apart. To wit, a low mark, hyperstigma, denoted a smaller unit than a clause, which was known as a comma. A mid-high mark, stigma mese, distinguished a clause or colon, and a high mark, stigma telea, denoted an entire sentence, known as a periodus. The Greeks also introduced a mark to distinguish paragraphs, paragraphos or gamma, and set off quotations with dipels. Now, not everyone was a fan of these marks. Given that their entire purpose was not synactical, but rather elocutionary, many, like the famous Roman orator Cicero from 106 to 43 BC, scorned such punctuation, noting things like when and how long to pause for breath ought to be determined not by a stroke interposed by a copyist, but by the constraint of the rhythm. Now, thanks to the influence of the Romans, the punctuation introduced by the Greeks languished as the oral tradition of Rome dominated. However, once Christianity began to spread across Europe via written texts, its scribes began punctuating again in order to try to preserve the original meaning of the sacred texts. As Lynn Truss famously notes, there is a big difference between eats, shoots, and leaves and eats, shoots, and leaves. Something that is better illustrated by text, which is why I'm showing it on the screen now. In addition, by the 7th and 8th centuries, spaces between words were becoming more common and are said to have been invented, or at least popularized, by Irish and Scottish monks of this era who were tired of wrestling with separating unfamiliar Latin words. Then, at the end of the 8th century, Charlemagne is generally credited with the introduction of lowercase letters after requesting that the monk Alcuin develop a unified alphabet, which ultimately included these lowercase letters. With the rise of the printing press a few centuries later, the numerous conventions and symbols used in punctuation became a bit of a problem for these printers. This was simply something that had really not been much of an issue when things were simply written by hand. Now enter Aldus Pius Manutius, a prominent Italian publisher and printer of the 15th century, who, besides famously introducing pocket editions of Greek and Roman classic works meant for mass consumption and relatively inexpensive to purchase, also seems to have been the first typographer to use the comma and the semicolon. He also, by the way, helped develop italic type with the help of Venetian punch cutter Francesco Griffo. Interestingly, Griffo seems to have met an untimely end after he beat his son-in-law to death with an iron bar and is presumed to have been executed for this crime. After being charged with this murder, there is no further historical record of him. Aldus's grandson, Aldo Manutius the Younger, from 1547 to 1597, took over the family printing business at the age of just 14. Not long after, he codified codified the modern standardized use of a comma, colon, and period, publishing a book on the subject in the early 1560s called Orthographiae Ratio, a system of orthography. In the book, Aldo built on the ancient Greeks' minimal punctuation marks and designated that the comma would separate phrases and clauses, the colon would be used for lists, and the full point, read period here, would denote the end of the sentence. Aldo also explains the uses of other basic punctuation, including the question mark, apostrophe, exclamation point, as well as quotation marks. Aldo also explicitly noted that the purpose of these marks was more than merely as a rhetorical aid, but that such marks were necessary in order to express and preserve meaning, as previously identified by the Christian scribes centuries earlier. For English writers, however, while they did begin almost universally using the marks Aldo had expounded upon, punctuation remained widely thought of as primarily for elocution. Indeed, authors including George Puttenham in The Art of English Poesy from 1589 and Simon Daines in Orthopoeia Anglicana in 1640 even set out a standard for the proper use of a comma, semicolon, and a colon. They simply describe them as a pause of 1 unit, 2 units, and of 3, respectively. This began to change after the publication of Ben Jonson's English Grammar in 1640, in which he illustrated how punctuation could help preserve an author's original intention, rather than just give a guide on how to read a text out loud. Well received by the time of the Restoration from 1660, using punctuation for syntactical purposes was finally common, and in fact by the 18th century, excessive punctuation, such as placing a comma between every possible phrase, had become a major problem. Overuse of punctuation continued to some extent through the late 19th century until lexicographers Henry Watson Fowler and Francis George Fowler published The King's English in 1906. This book called for far less punctuation and established the style of light punctuation that indeed endures to this day. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, let me thank our patrons on Patreon. If you're interested in supporting us in making these daily videos, please do help us out on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TodayIFoundOut. And as always, thank you for watching.